Moscow, late 1990s. A city trying to heal after the collapse of the Soviet Union. People rushed through cold streets, chasing new dreams, new freedoms, new identities. But beneath that energy, beneath the noise of markets and metro stations, something darker was waking up, something no one noticed. Until it was too late. In the middle of this restless city stood Bitsevsky Park, a massive forest of twisting paths, shadowed corners, and silence that felt unnatural even in broad daylight. Locals called it the Forest of Death. Most people avoided it after sunset. Some avoided it even in the morning. And they were right to be afraid. Because while Moscow celebrated the rush of a new era, one man walked through those woods with a goal so terrifying, so calculated, that it would shock the entire world. A man who believed killing wasn't just violence, it was strategy, it was power, it was a game. His name was Alexander Pichushkin. To outsiders, he looked ordinary. A lonely man working at a supermarket. A quiet neighbor who kept to himself. Someone you wouldn't notice twice. But in his mind, a game board was already forming. 64 squares, 64 kills. One murder for every square on a chessboard. It began with a single victim. Then another. Then another. Bodies started appearing around the park, beaten, strangled, thrown into sewer drains, left beneath trees. At first, police thought they were accidents, drunks, homeless men, people no one would miss. They didn't realize that someone was watching them, studying them, testing how long he could keep killing without being caught. For years, he walked through Moscow like a ghost, unnoticed, unstoppable, and always hunting his next piece. By the time the world understood what was happening, he had become one of the deadliest killers in Russian history. This is not just the story of a murderer. This is the story of a system that failed to see him, a city that lived beside him, and a mind that turned human life into a game. A story where every move brought him closer to his ultimate goal, checkmate. Every serial killer story begins long before the first crime, long before the world knows their name, long before the headlines scream their horrors. And in the case of Alexander Pichushkin, the man who would one day be called the chessboard killer, the story begins in a quiet apartment block on the edge of Moscow, a place where loneliness, trauma, and darkness slowly shaped a monster. He was born in 1974, a seemingly ordinary child in a country still recovering from the weight of Soviet collapse. But even in his earliest years, something was different about Alexander. He rarely smiled. He avoided other children. He preferred silence over conversation, shadows over sunlight. Everything changed when he was just a small boy. He fell, or was pushed, from a swing in a playground accident that fractured his skull. Doctors saved his life, but not his mind. The injury damaged parts of his brain responsible for impulse control and empathy. After the accident, his behavior twisted sharply, outbursts of anger, sudden cruelty, and obsession with control. His mother noticed, but poverty and survival left little time for therapy. Russia in the late Soviet era had no space for mental health. A child who behaved strangely was simply labeled difficult. And so, Alexander continued to grow, isolated, misunderstood, boiling inside with emotions he didn't know how to process. When he turned 14, his grandfather stepped in. A quiet, disciplined man, he became the most stable presence in Alexander's life. He taught him to play chess, not as a game, but as a way to sharpen the mind, to understand patterns, strategy, and human weakness. Chess became Alexander's sanctuary, but it also became something dangerous. It taught him to think several moves ahead, to anticipate actions before they happened, to see people not as humans but as pieces on a board. Then, tragedy struck again. His grandfather died suddenly, and whatever fragile stability Alexander had left was shattered. He moved to a technical school, but bullying followed him everywhere. Classmates mocked him for his appearance, his silence, and inside his mind, resentment was building, a hatred of humiliation, a hunger for power, a desire to feel in control again. He kept his emotions bottled up, hidden behind a quiet face. But rage simmered beneath the surface, waiting for a trigger. In the mid-1990s, Russia was falling apart. Crime was skyrocketing, police were underfunded, and society was struggling to adapt to capitalism. It was the perfect environment for predators to rise unnoticed, and that is exactly what happened. Pichushkin found work at a local supermarket. He walked the same streets every day, passing through Bitsevsky Park, a massive forested area on the outskirts of Moscow known for its darkness and isolation. This park would become his hunting ground, a place where the rising darkness inside him finally met the perfect stage. Because the boy who lived in the shadows was about to step into the world as a killer. Every serial killer has a beginning, a moment where dark fantasies stop living inside the mind and step into the real world. For Alexander Pichushkin, that moment came in the early 1990s, deep inside the shadows of Bitsevsky Park, the forest that would later be known as the Forest of Death. But in the beginning, there was just a lonely teenager and a desire to prove something to himself. After the death of his grandfather, the only man he had ever truly connected with, Pichushkin felt abandoned, numb, and burning with a kind of rage that had no outlet. His grandfather had taught him discipline, chess, and structure. When he died, Alexander lost not just a mentor, he lost the only voice that ever guided him away from his darker impulses. And now, nothing stood between him and the growing storm inside his mind. According to Pichushkin, the urge to kill was not sudden. It grew slowly, like a fire spreading under ashes. He fantasized for months, pacing through Bitsevsky Park, imagining different ways he could take a life without being caught. He wanted control. He wanted power. And most disturbingly, he wanted to feel something, anything, again. His first target was a boy from his own neighborhood, not an enemy, not a stranger. Just someone he thought wouldn't be missed. The boy trusted him. They had played together before. He followed Pichushkin willingly into the forest, unaware that this walk would be his last. They wandered through the trees, talking casually. But inside Alexander's mind, a storm was building. Every step felt heavier. Every breath felt louder. His heart pounded not from fear, but from excitement. When they reached a secluded part of the park, Pichushkin picked up a glass bottle. He hesitated, not because of guilt, but because this was the moment that would define the rest of his life. Then he struck. The bottle smashed against the boy's head, with a sound that echoed through the silent forest. The boy collapsed, stunned, confused. Pichushkin hit him again and again, until the bottle shattered completely. Blood stained the ground. The boy stopped moving. Standing over the body, breathing heavily, Pichushkin felt something he had never felt before, a rush. A sense of power so intoxicating that he later described it as better than drugs, better than sex. He pushed the body into a nearby sewer opening, trying to hide the evidence. But inside, he felt victorious, alive, awake. It was in that moment he realized something terrifying. He wanted to do it again. Not out of necessity, but out of desire. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't an accident. This was the birth of a killer. And although police later ruled the death as a suicide, yes, a child's murder labeled a suicide, that mistake became the fuel Pichushkin needed. He now believed two things. He was good at killing, and he could get away with it. This was the first piece on the chessboard. The first step in a horrifying game that would leave Moscow living in fear for over a decade. For most people, a chessboard is a game, a battle of minds, a test of strategy, a quiet contest played in parks and living rooms. But for Alexander Pichushkin, it became something else. Something horrifying. Something that would frame his entire identity as one of Russia's most calculating serial killers. Every killer has a motive. Some seek revenge. Some crave control. Some act out of impulse or madness. But Pichushkin, he wanted to play. After his first murder, the deadly push into the sewer well, something inside him ignited. a rush he later described as a feeling stronger than love. Most killers would hide from that terrifying emotion. Pichushkin embraced it. He did not just want to kill. He wanted to kill systematically, with structure, purpose, and design. A mind driven not by rage, but by strategy. And that's when he created his most chilling idea, the chessboard plan. At his home in Moscow, Pichushkin opened a small wooden drawer. Inside lay a standard chessboard to 64 squares, alternating black and white, simple, harmless. But in his distorted imagination, each square represented a life he wanted to take. 64 murders. One for every square. Only then, he believed, would his masterpiece be complete. He wasn't just planning a series of killings. He was building a scoreboard, a personal achievement, a dark legacy he could measure. And in his mind, every murder would be a strategic move, like capturing pieces in a grand deadly game. Some killers fear being caught. Pichushkin feared not fulfilling his plan. He began studying the park more carefully. He watched the paths, the lighting, the blind spots. He memorized when people arrived, when they left, which benches stayed empty the longest. Every detail mattered. Every step was calculated. His victims were chosen the way a chess player selects which piece to sacrifice next. Sometimes he picked homeless men. Sometimes older alcoholics. Sometimes people who trusted him. And eventually, even colleagues and acquaintances. Anyone could become a pawn. To lure them, he used the same trick again and again. A shared drink in the woods, a casual walk, a moment of false friendship. While laughing and talking, he would lead them deep into Pichushkin Park, where no one could hear screams through the thick trees. He carried a hammer concealed beneath his coat or bag. A single blow to the back of the head, fast, silent, decisive, like striking a piece off the board. Then he experimented with something even darker, pushing broken vodka bottles into the victims, skull wounds to prevent identification. Cold, calculated, methodical. This was no impulsive killer. This was someone fulfilling a self-made destiny. As the number of victims grew, so did Pichushkin's confidence. He documented his progress secretly. He told himself he was an artist of death, and the chessboard was his canvas. No remorse, no hesitation, no doubt, just 64 squares. 64 planned murders. And a man marching through the shadows of Moscow with one obsession, to complete the board. Pichushkin Park. To most Muscovites, it was nothing more than a sprawling forest, a peaceful place where children played, elderly couples walked, and workers escaped the noise of the city. But for Alexander Pichushkin, this was not a park. It was a hunting ground, a sanctuary for his darkest impulses. A place where the boundaries between life and death blurred beneath the thick canopy of trees. During the 1990s and early 2000s, Moscow was changing rapidly. People were focused on rebuilding their lives after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Crime was rising. Police forces were overwhelmed. And in the chaos of transition, one killer found the perfect place to operate undetected. Pichushkin Park was massive, nearly 22 square kilometers of twisting paths, deep woods, abandoned structures, and forgotten corners where no one ever looked twice. In winter, snow blanketed the ground so heavily that footprints disappeared within minutes. In summer, vegetation grew so thick it swallowed entire pathways. It was a place where you could scream, and no one would hear. Pichushkin chose this location deliberately. He knew every trail, every isolated clearing, every dead end. He had grown up playing here as a child. Now he returned as a predator. He often lured victims with a simple, friendly gesture. Let's take a walk in the park. I have vodka. We can talk. To a stranger, he seemed harmless, a lonely young man wanting company. To those he knew personally, he was simply Sasha, the quiet guy from the neighborhood. But behind that soft voice and polite smile, something monstrous waited. Once deep enough inside the park, he changed. The friendliness vanished. The mask dropped. His voice hardened. His footsteps shifted. Witnesses who survived described the transformation as instant, terrifying, like a switch turning on. The trees became silent witnesses. The thick branches hid everything. Pichushkin often carried a small hammer concealed in a plastic bag. He used it with cold efficiency, a quick, brutal blow to the skull. Sometimes he strangled his victims. Sometimes he pushed them into sewer pits or ravines. To him, these were not murders. They were moves in his twisted chess game. Many of his victims were vulnerable, homeless men, alcoholics, elderly individuals, people society rarely noticed. They were easy to approach and even easier to forget. And that was exactly why Pichushkin targeted them. Bodies began appearing in the park, some partially hidden under leaves, some tossed into underground tunnels, some not found for months. At first, police assumed that deaths were accidents, drunks falling, freezing, or fighting. No one imagined a serial killer was stalking the woods. Pichushkin counted on that. He knew the police would not connect the dots. Not yet. The park itself seemed to protect him. Fog, darkness, noise from nearby roads, and endless trails made it impossible to track movements. Even search teams often got lost. Every kill fed his growing obsession. Every return to the park deepened his confidence. He began visiting almost daily, walking the paths like a king surveying his kingdom. Besevsky Park, for most people, was just a forest. For Pichushkin, it was something far more chilling, a place where he believed he had absolute power. A place where he played God. A place where death waited in silence beneath the trees. In every serial killer case, the world remembers the murderer. The headlines, the documentaries, the fear, everything revolves around the monster. But in Alexander Pichushkin's story, the true tragedy lies somewhere else. In the victims almost no one noticed, the ones society walked past every day without seeing, hearing, or caring. By the late 1990s, Moscow was a city divided. Skyscrapers rose beside crumbling Soviet apartment blocks. New money clashed with old poverty. People worked long hours and kept to themselves. And in this fast-moving, indifferent city, thousands simply slipped through the cracks. These were the people Pichushkin targeted. He didn't go after wealthy socialized or protected families. He didn't break into homes or stalk his victims for days. He walked through Besevsky Park, the sprawling forest on the edge of Moscow, and looked for the same kind of people, again and again. Lonely pensioners, homeless men, alcoholics, outcasts, people who wandered the park simply to escape the noise of the city, people the world barely acknowledged. People whose absence would go unnoticed. And Pichushkin knew it. He understood one horrifying truth. If you target those no one sees, no one will look for them. His method was disturbingly simple. He approached men sitting alone on benches, drinking cheap vodka, talking to themselves, or feeding birds. He acted friendly, sometimes even generous. He offered a drink, a walk, a conversation. He studied their loneliness, their vulnerabilities, the emptiness in their eyes. And then he struck. One moment, they were sharing a bottle. The next, they were being dragged deeper into the forest. Some victims were smashed with a hammer. Others were thrown into sewage pits or underground channels. A few were pushed into the park's hidden well alive, their bodies swallowed instantly by darkness and cold water. For weeks, months, even years, no one connected these disappearances. Police reports were sparse. Most victims had no families to file complaints. Many weren't even identified properly. They simply vanished into the city's silent, overlooked corners. And that was exactly what Pichushkin counted on. But the tragedy wasn't just that they died. It was that many never lived a life anyone valued. One victim was a lonely factory worker who'd recently lost his job. Another was an elderly man feeding stray dogs because he had no one else to talk to. Another was a homeless teenager who slept on benches in the park during summer nights. These were ordinary people, forgotten by society long before Pichushkin found them. He didn't just kill them. He exploited their isolation, turning their invisibility into a weapon. Every new murder fed his obsession. Every victim checked another square on his mental chessboard. And as long as he targeted the unseen, he knew he could continue. This is why the story of Alexander Pichushkin isn't just about a killer. It's about the tragic truth of modern cities. When people become invisible, so do their deaths. And by the time the authorities realized what was happening, there were already dozens of victims. Men whose names would never make headlines, men whose stories ended deep in the forest, men who deserved to be remembered long before a killer chose them. When serial killers strike, the world always asks the same question: how did no one stop him sooner? In the case of Alexander Pichushkin, the answer is far more disturbing than anyone expected. Because the truth is, he didn't stay hidden because he was brilliant. He stayed hidden because the system around him kept failing, again and again. And every failure created space for another victim. In the 1990s, Russia was still recovering from the collapse of the Soviet Union. Law enforcement was underfunded, overwhelmed, and desperate. Violent crime skyrocketed. Murders, robberies, disappearances. There were too many cases and too few detectives. The police force was exhausted, drowning in chaos. Into this broken system walked Pichushkin. Quiet, polite, forgettable. The perfect predator for a city where thousands went missing each year. One of the biggest mistakes began with the location. Bitsevsky Park, a massive wild forest inside Moscow, was practically made for crime. Dense trees, narrow paths, countless hiding spots. At night, the park transformed into a dark maze where screams vanished into nothing. Locals called it the forest of no return, but police pocketed that fear until it was too late. When people went missing inside the park, investigators rarely connected the dots. They assumed some victims were homeless. Some were alcoholics. Some had run away. Others were simply unknown persons. Russia's post-Soviet bureaucracy barely kept track of the living. Tracking the dead was nearly impossible. Pichushkin exploited this chaos beautifully. He targeted people he believed the world wouldn't miss. And most times, he was right. But the biggest mistake came from an assumption police carried for years. They believed Moscow already had a serial killer, the infamous Andrei Chikatilo, executed in 1994. In their minds, Russia had already faced its monster. It was unthinkable that another one could be walking the streets just a few years later. This false belief blinded investigators completely. Every new body found in the park looked like just another murder in a violent city. No pattern, no urgency, no suspicion. Even when bodies began piling up with nearly identical injuries, head crushed by a blunt object, often pushed into the wound, it took years before anyone realized this was the work of one man. By then, dozens had already died. Another mistake: victims who escaped were not believed. One woman, who survived being pushed into a well by Pichushkin, went to the police. She gave his name, his description, even his address. Police ignored her. They assumed she was drunk, or lying, or confused. That single dismissal allowed him to continue killing for years. These failures weren't small errors. They were cracks, huge, gaping cracks through which Pichushkin slipped again and again. He didn't hide. He didn't run. He didn't change identities. He killed openly, confidently, fearlessly, because he knew no one was looking for him. No one cared enough to notice. No one believed a monster like him could live among them. And as long as the system remained blind, Alexander Pichushkin kept filling his chessboard, one victim at a time. By the late 1990s, something deeply disturbing had begun to take shape in the shadows of Bitsevsky Park, a pattern so twisted, so calculated, that investigators would later describe it as mathematical murder. And at the center of it stood Alexander Pichushkin, a man whose mind operated with the cold logic of a machine and the violent hunger of a predator. Serial killers often have impulses. They act in bursts, driven by sudden rage or opportunity. But Pichushkin was different. His killing wasn't impulsive. It was systematic, mapped out, and organized with an almost chilling sense of purpose. He believed murder wasn't just an act. It was a career, a mission, a puzzle he was determined to complete, one victim at a time. And the police? They had no idea a monster was walking among them. The first sign of his escalating madness came with consistency. Each killing followed a rhythm, a pattern that only he understood. Pichushkin would spend hours in the park, watching people move through the trees, studying them the way a chess player studies his opponent's vulnerabilities. He wasn't choosing victims randomly. He targeted people who lived on the margins of society, elderly pensioners, homeless men, addicts, lonely wanderers, people who came and went without anyone noticing. To him, they were the perfect pieces for his game. He approached them casually, pretending to be friendly. He offered vodka, cigarettes, conversation. And once they followed him deeper into the forest, away from the walking paths, away from witnesses, he struck a hammer, a blow to the back of the head, a push into a well. The same method, the same routine, the same ritual, repeated again and again. To Pichushkin, each kill was a move on the chessboard. And with every victim, the game progressed. But what made him particularly dangerous wasn't just his brutality, it was his self-control. Unlike many murderers, Pichushkin didn't rush. He didn't panic. He didn't leave chaotic scenes behind. He treated murder like a discipline. After each kill, he returned to his daily life. He fed stray dogs. He talked to neighbors politely. He visited his grandfather's grave. To everyone around him, he looked normal, even kind. And this double life allowed the pattern to grow unnoticed. Only two things occasionally betrayed him: his need for escalation. As he grew more confident, he killed more frequently. Sometimes 2 victims in a week, sometimes 3. His twisted desire for recognition. Pichushkin once said, "A killer is like a god. He decides who lives and who dies." He wanted someone to know what he was doing, someone to acknowledge his skill. This desire would eventually become his weakness. But for now, in the late 90s and early 2000s, Moscow police still had no idea that more than a dozen bodies in Bitsa Park were connected. They wrote them off as drunken accidents, suicides, or unremarkable deaths of people society had forgotten. Meanwhile, Pichushkin's gang grew bolder, more organized, more confident. The pattern was forming. A pattern of madness that only one person could see clearly, the killer himself. And he wasn't even close to finishing. For years, Alexander Pichushkin hunted in complete darkness, not literal darkness, but the darkness of society's blind spots. He chose victims no one looked for, no one protected, and often, no one even remembered. This is why he became so confident, so comfortable, so unstoppable. But one day, he made a mistake that would finally tear apart the illusion of his invincibility. He chose the wrong victim. He targeted a woman who refused to die. Her name was Marina Moskalyova, a quiet supermarket worker, a single mother, and someone who believed in kindness even in a city as cold as Moscow. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't socially powerful. But she was smart, far smarter than Pichushkin expected. And her courage would become the turning point in one of modern Russia's darkest crime stories. Marina knew Pichushkin from work. He offered her help, company, small conversations. Nothing threatening, nothing unusual. He pretended to be gentle, polite, harmless, the same mask he wore around everyone. When he invited her for a walk in Bitsevsky Park, she agreed. Why wouldn't she? He looked ordinary, spoke normally, and carried no hint of danger. But Marina did something no other victim had done. Before leaving, she wrote a note. A simple, innocent line. "I'm going for a walk with Sasha Pichushkin." She left it at home, in a place her family would definitely see. It was a small detail. But in stories like this, small details save lives, or at least reveal the truth. When they entered the park, Pichushkin followed his usual ritual. He guided her deeper into the forest, toward the same places where he killed dozens before her. His heart raced with excitement. For him, murder was not just violence, it was a game, a move on his imaginary chessboard. But Marina sensed something odd. His footsteps became faster. His breathing changed. And when he suddenly struck her, she didn't collapse like his usual victims. She fought. She fought harder than anyone had ever fought him. Marina clawed at him, screamed, struggled wildly. Pichushkin later admitted he was shocked, confused, and even afraid. For the first time, his victim wasn't passive. She wasn't weak. She wasn't accepting death. In that chaotic moment, she left behind traces, hair, fingerprints, fragments of her struggle, things he never had to worry about before. He eventually overpowered her. He killed her, but the damage was done. Her body was found quickly, and when officials searched her home, they found the note. That one line. I'm going for a walk with Sasha Pichushkin. For the first time in 10 years, investigators had a name. A real suspect. A person who could be connected directly, undeniably, to a victim's final moments, and Pichushkin had no idea. While he walked the streets believing he had committed another perfect kill, the police were already circling him. Forensic teams matched the evidence to his workplace. His friends noticed his absence. Investigators linked him to other disappearances. Marina Moskalyova, a woman he thought would vanish like the rest, became the spark that finally burned through his lies. She was the only victim who left a trail. The only one who refused to go quietly. The only one who fought back with enough force to expose a monster, and because of her, the unstoppable chessboard killer was finally cornered. For more than a decade, Alexander Pichushkin hunted his victims inside Moscow's Bitsa Park with absolute confidence. He believed he was untouchable. The police had no pattern, no motive, no surviving witnesses, until one woman lived. And her survival cracked open a case that had baffled investigators for years. But the downfall of the chessboard killer didn't happen in one moment. It was a chain reaction, a trail of mistakes, overlooked evidence, and a killer who thought he was smarter than everyone else. The first crack appears when Maria Virikeva escaped his attack and went straight to the police. It should have ended right there. She gave his description. She knew where he worked. She even recognized his voice. But the officer she reported it to ignored her, dismissing her as confused. That failure almost allowed Pichushkin to continue indefinitely. But something changed after 2005. The number of victims was rising too quickly. The brutality was becoming impossible to ignore. The bodies began showing similar head wounds. Police finally admitted they were dealing with a serial killer. And Pichushkin, in his arrogance, started making mistakes. A killer who needed control. Unlike most serial killers, Pichushkin wanted the world to know he existed. He had grown frustrated watching Andrei Chikatilo, the Rostov Ripper, become a legend. He wanted to surpass him, craved recognition, needed attention, so he escalated. He killed more frequently. He stopped hiding some bodies deeply. He left corpses closer to the park's pathways. It was almost as if he wanted someone to notice. One body in particular, a woman named Marina Moskalyova, became the key to his downfall. Marina worked at the same store as Pichushkin. The two had spoken before. On the day she disappeared, she left her home with a note for her son. I'm meeting Sasha from work. Sasha, short for Alexander. Her body was found in Bitsa Park with the same brutal head injuries as the others. For the first time, police had a direct link. A killer caught on camera. When detectives traced Marina's last movements, they discovered something Pichushkin never anticipated: Moscow's metro surveillance cameras. Footage from the station showed Marina walking beside a tall, dark-haired man. Pichushkin, clear as daylight. It was undeniable. The same man she had written about in her note. The same man who worked at her grocery store. The same man whose description Maria Virikeva had given a year earlier. The police put him under immediate surveillance. They watched him walk to Bitsa Park alone. They watched him return hours later. They watched him follow the same ritual again and again. Everything fit. The arrest. On June 16, 2006, officers confronted Pichushkin. He didn't run. He didn't deny anything. He simply looked at them with cold, empty eyes. as if he'd been waiting for this moment. When Russian media reported his arrest, people were stunned. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a quiet store clerk, an average man who lived alone in a cramped apartment with his aging mother. But inside his mind, he had been playing a deadly game for years, and now the board had finally collapsed around him. His capture marked the end of one of Russia's most chilling killing sprees. But the most shocking part wasn't that he was caught. The most shocking part was what he admitted next. Moscow, a city of bright lights, crowded metros, and restless lives. But beneath this modern surface lies something darker, a history of shadows, secrets, and monsters that walked among ordinary people without ever being noticed. And in the early 2000s, one such monster was quietly perfecting his game. He didn't wear a mask. He didn't lurk in abandoned buildings. He didn't stalk people at night like a ghost. He walked through busy markets. He rode the same metro as millions of others. He greeted neighbors politely, and yet, all the while, he carried a plan so cold, so calculated, that it still shakes Russia today. His goal was simple: kill 64 people. One for every square on a chessboard. To him, murder wasn't just violence. It was a game. A twisted puzzle he believed he was destined to complete. His name was Alexander Pichushkin, but the world would later call him the chessboard killer. This isn't just the story of a serial killer. It's the story of how a quiet, lonely boy grew into one of the most dangerous predators in modern Russia. How he exploited a broken system, targeted the invisible, and turned a public park into a hunting ground. And how one brave woman's survival changed everything. It's a story of failure, police failures, social failures, human failures. A story about the victims society forgot, and the killer no one saw coming. In a city of millions, he believed he was untouchable. He believed he was smarter than the police. He believed no one could stop him. But every game ends sooner or later. Even for a man who thought he could outsmart the world. This is the chilling, shocking, and deeply disturbing truth behind one of Russia's most horrifying serial killers. This is the story of Alexander Pichushkin, the chessboard killer. Let's begin.